Hey everyone, just pause for a second and really let this hit you. 11 days. That's all it would have taken. 11 short days of walking. The Bible itself tells us this in black and white. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. From Mount Sinai, where God had just met them in thunder and fire, to the very edge of the Promised Land, 11 days. That's it. A straight shot, a reasonable hike. You could almost do it in a long weekend if you pushed hard. Instead, it took 40 years. 40 long, brutal years. An entire generation, every single man and woman over the age of 20 died out there in the wilderness. Not one of them, except Joshua and Caleb, ever set foot in the land flowing with milk and honey that God had sworn to give them. Their bones were left scattered across the burning sand from one end of the desert to the other. Graves unmarked, dreams unfulfilled, lives ended in dust. Think about that for just a moment. The same God who had just crushed the mightiest empire on earth with 10 supernatural plagues, the same God who parted the Red Sea like it was nothing more than a curtain being drawn back, the same God who dropped bread from heaven every single morning to feed millions of hungry people, that God looked at his own chosen people and said, "No, you will not enter. You will wander. You will die out here." Why? Why would a God of such power and promise do that to the very people he had rescued? This isn't some nice little Sunday school story with a tidy moral at the end. This is one of the most disturbing, most uncomfortable, and honestly, most life-changing chapters in the entire Bible. Because the answer to why 40 years instead of 11 days is going to force you to look in the mirror at your own life in a way that might make you squirm. It's going to expose things about your heart, about the way you think, about the deserts you're walking through right now, maybe the ones you've been stuck in for years. But hang with me, don't click away, because by the time we reach the end of this video, I promise you're going to understand something profound about God's character, about your own heart, and about the wilderness seasons in your life that you've never quite seen clearly before. This isn't just ancient history, this is your story too. Let's go back to the beginning and walk through it together, slowly, honestly, because the truth here isn't easy, but it's worth every second. Let's rewind the clock and set the stage, because you can't understand the desert unless you first feel the weight of what came before it. For over 400 years, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were slaves in Egypt. Not visitors, not immigrants, slaves. Generation after generation born into chains, living under the merciless Egyptian sun, making bricks without straw when the quotas got impossible. Their backs were ripped open with whips. Their babies, every newborn Hebrew boy, was ordered thrown into the Nile to drown. Imagine that kind of terror becoming normal. Imagine growing up knowing that your worth was measured by how many bricks you could produce and how quietly you could endure the beatings. That kind of trauma doesn't just scar the body, it rewires the mind. It reshapes how an entire people think, how they feel about themselves, how they see God, how they view freedom. 4 centuries of dehumanization leave deep grooves in the soul. You don't shake that off overnight. Then God stepped in. He raised up a deliverer named Moses, a Hebrew baby hidden in a basket among the reeds of the Nile, rescued and raised in Pharaoh's palace, exiled to the desert after killing an Egyptian taskmaster in rage, and finally called back through a bush that burned but was not consumed. God spoke from that fire. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them." Those words still echo with tenderness and power. After 400 years of silence, after generations of unanswered prayers, God says, "I see, I hear, I know, and I have come down." And come down he did. The plagues fell one after another, each one dismantling a different Egyptian deity, proving that the God of Israel was supreme. The Nile turned to blood, darkness covered the land for 3 days, and in the final heart-stopping plague, the firstborn of Egypt died in one night. Pharaoh's will shattered. "Go," he said, "take everything and get out." And on that Passover night, millions walked free, carrying gold and silver the Egyptians pressed into their hands in their terror. They walked out under the shadow of a God who had just humbled the mightiest nation on earth. But here's the heartbreaking reality that sets up everything that follows. They walked out of Egypt in a single night, but Egypt did not walk out of them. The slave mentality, the fear, the victim identity, the deep-seated belief that they were powerless and worthless, that took much longer to uproot. And that's where the story turns to tragedy. Now let's talk about the miracles that should have changed everything. 10 plagues, one after another, each more devastating, each more targeted. The Nile, Egypt's lifeblood, turned to blood. Frogs covered the land, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail mixed with fire, locusts that ate everything green, 3 days of tangible darkness so thick you could feel it, and then the final blow, death to every firstborn in Egypt. From Pharaoh's palace to the lowliest prisoner, no household was spared. That night, the death angel passed over homes marked with lamb's blood, the first Passover. Pharaoh broke completely. "Get out," he cried. "Take your flocks, your herds, everything. Just go." And in one extraordinary night, a nation of slaves became a nation on the move. They didn't leave empty-handed. The Egyptians, in their panic, gave them gold, silver, clothing, wealth they had never dreamed of. They walked out under the protection of a God who had just brought the world's superpower to its knees. Imagine the emotion of that moment. After 400 years of oppression, after generations of crying out, after believing perhaps God had forgotten them, suddenly they were free. Walking, breathing free air, carrying treasures, singing songs of deliverance. It should have been the end of the story. Freedom achieved, promised land next. But freedom is more than a change of location. Freedom is a change of heart. And while God took Israel out of Egypt in a single dramatic night, taking Egypt out of Israel, the fear, the victim mindset, the dependence on human masters, the distorted view of God as distant or unreliable, that was going to take much longer. The core theme of this whole story is right here in that one line. They walked out of Egypt, but Egypt did not walk out of them. The slave mentality clung like dust, the fear of authority, the instinct to complain instead of trust, the tendency to romanticize the past when the present got hard. All of it still lived inside them, and God knew it. He had seen it in their hearts long before they crossed the Red Sea. The miracles were real, the deliverance was real, but miracles alone don't transform a slave into a son. They don't rewrite identity. They don't heal deep trauma. For that, something more was needed, something slower, something painful, something called the wilderness. And that's exactly where God was leading them, not to punish them, but to remake them. Because the Promised Land isn't just a place, it's a people ready to live in it as free sons and daughters, not as fearful slaves. Just days after leaving Egypt, the first real test arrives. Pharaoh changes his mind, again. He gathers his army, 600 of the best chariots, horses, cavalry, infantry, the most feared military machine in the ancient world. They thunder across the desert in pursuit. The Israelites are camped by the Red Sea. Behind them, the dust cloud of death closing in fast. In front of them, nothing but water. Trapped, no way out. And what do? They turn on Moses with words that should shock us. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you to leave us alone? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Did you catch that? They had been free for a matter of days, and already they were saying slavery was better. They were rewriting 400 years of whips, chains, and murdered babies into something almost nostalgic. At least in Egypt, we knew what to expect. That's human nature laid bare. We do the same thing. We romanticize the prisons we know because the freedom we don't know terrifies us. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. But God wasn't finished. Moses lifts his staff. A strong east wind blows all night. By morning, the sea is divided. 2 walls of water standing like towers, dry ground between them. An entire nation, men, women, children, elderly, livestock, walks through on the seabed. When the Egyptians follow, God closes the waters. Chariots, horses, soldiers, gone.
In minutes, the most powerful army on earth ceases to exist. Israel erupts. They sing, they dance. Miriam grabs a tambourine and leads the women in celebration. It was the greatest day of their lives. But here's what most people miss. The Red Sea wasn't just a rescue, it was a severance. When those waters crashed down on Pharaoh's army, they also crashed down on any possibility of return. The road back to Egypt was gone, buried under the sea. God didn't just open a door forward, he locked the door behind them forever. No going back, physically impossible. And yet, the terrifying part, even with the door locked, even with no way physically to return, the hearts of the people would spend the next 40 years trying to go back to a place that no longer existed. Pharaoh was dead in the water, but the Pharaoh in their heads was still alive, still whispering, "You're nothing. You're slaves. Freedom is too dangerous." That's the battle that mattered most, and that's why the desert was necessary.
Here's the principle that runs like a thread through the entire story, and it's one that will change how you see your own life if you let it sink in. God can change your circumstances in a single night. He can shatter empires, part seas, drop bread from heaven, bury armies underwater, all in a moment. But changing your mind, changing the way you see yourself, the way you respond to fear, the way you trust him, that is a process. And sometimes that process takes a very long time. God took Israel out of Egypt overnight, but taking Egypt out of Israel, the slave mentality, the fear-based thinking, the victim identity, that required 40 years. Some of them never let it go. They carried Egypt in their hearts until the day they died in the sand. How long did the gratitude from the Red Sea last? 3 days. 3 days after watching God split an ocean for them, they arrive at Marah. There's water, but it's bitter, undrinkable, and immediately they turn on Moses. What are we supposed to drink? No prayer, no remembrance of the sea, just complaint, just accusation. God responded with grace. He shows Moses a piece of wood to throw into the water, and it becomes sweet. Crisis solved, lesson offered. But was the lesson learned? Not yet. The pattern was set. Miracle followed by complaint, provision followed by grumbling. And that pattern reveals the deeper issue. The problem was never the lack of evidence. The problem was the lens through which they viewed everything. Their lens was still shaped by 400 years of slavery. They saw threats everywhere. They saw God as unreliable. They saw themselves as victims. And no miracle, no matter how dramatic, could instantly change that lens. It had to be reshaped slowly, daily, through dependence, through waiting, through the wilderness. Here's where it gets personal. How many of us have experienced a sudden breakthrough, an answered prayer, a door opened, a season of freedom, and thought, this is it, I'm finally free. Then 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months later, the old fears creep back. The old complaints return. The old identity whispers, you're still not enough. Go back to what you know. God can change your situation overnight, but he often lets the mind change take time, because that's where real freedom happens. That's where you become someone who can walk into the promised land and actually stay there, not turn around and long for Egypt. The desert isn't punishment, it's the classroom where God teaches us to see with new eyes. The tests kept coming, each one exposing the same root issue. At Marah, bitter water, immediate complaint. God sweetens it with a piece of wood, grace. Then, a month and a half later, the grumbling erupts again, this time over food. And the words they use are shocking. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of wheat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Stop right there. They are romanticizing slavery. They're talking about pots of meat as if they were dining at Pharaoh's table. They were slaves. Slaves don't sit around pots of meat. They ate scraps if they ate at all. But the human mind has an incredible ability to rewrite the past when the present feels uncomfortable. They turn 400 years of oppression into a nostalgic memory of abundance. We do the same thing. How many times have you looked back at a toxic relationship, a dead-end job, a destructive habit, and thought, at least I knew what to expect? How many of us would rather return to a familiar cage than step into an unfamiliar freedom? God could have responded with anger. Instead, he responded with provision. That evening, flocks of quail covered the camp, so many the people gathered all they could eat. And the next morning, when the dew lifted, the ground was covered with something no one had ever seen, a thin, white, flake-like substance that tasted like honey wafers. Man-hu, the people asked, what is it? And so it was called manna, bread from heaven. Every morning for the next 40 years, manna appeared on the ground. Every family gathered just enough for that day. If you tried to hoard it overnight, it rotted and filled with worms. If you gathered too little, somehow you still had enough. This wasn't just food, this was a daily masterclass in trust. Every single morning you had to believe God would provide again. You couldn't stockpile grace. You couldn't save up faith for a rainy day. You had to wake up, step out, and trust, fresh every morning. Moses later explained the deeper meaning in Deuteronomy 8. God humbled you, caused you to hunger, then fed you with manna to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. He was reprogramming their instincts from depending on Pharaoh to depending on him, from earning provision to receiving it as grace.
The manna wasn't random. It was intentional discipleship on a national scale. Every morning, thin flakes appeared on the ground like frost, sweet like honey wafers. The people gathered just enough for that day, no more, no less. If anyone tried to hoard it overnight, it bred worms and stank by morning. But on Friday, when God commanded them to gather double for the Sabbath, the extra portion stayed perfectly fresh. No rot, no worms. Same substance, same conditions, different outcome. Why? Because obedience preserves what hoarding destroys. When God tells you to save, it lasts. When you try to save out of fear and distrust, it rots in your hands. For 40 years, this happened every single day. No exceptions, no days off. It was relentless training in dependence. In Egypt, bread came from Pharaoh. You worked for it, you earned it, you depended on a human master for survival. In the desert, bread came from heaven. You didn't earn it, you couldn't earn it. You woke up and it was there, undeserved, unmerited, faithful. God was dismantling the slave economy in their minds and replacing it with a grace economy. You do not work for my love, you receive it fresh every morning. And here's something that should stop you in your tracks. Thousands of years later, when the devil tempted Jesus in the wilderness, Jesus quoted the exact words from Deuteronomy about the manna. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The manna was never just about physical survival. It was a prophecy pointing forward to something, someone far greater. Jesus himself would later declare, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. The manna was always a shadow. Jesus is the substance. Every morning for 40 years, God was teaching Israel and teaching us that real life comes not from what we can produce or hoard, but from trusting His word, His provision, His presence one day at a time. You can't stockpile yesterday's grace for tomorrow's problems. You have to wake up each morning and say, Lord, I trust you for today. That's the lesson the desert was designed to burn into their souls. And that's the lesson God often burns into ours when we walk through our own wilderness seasons. He's not withholding, He's retraining. He's teaching us to live by faith, not by sight, not by savings accounts, not by backup plans, but by the daily word and daily bread that comes from His mouth. The tests kept coming, each one revealing the same heart issue. At Rephidim, they quarreled again over water. Give us water to drink, they demanded. Moses cried out to God, what am I supposed to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. God told Moses to strike the rock with his staff. Water poured out, enough for millions. Another miracle, another complaint resolved, another lesson ignored. Then came Amalek, Israel's first battle as a free people. While Joshua led the fight on the plain below, Moses stood on a hilltop with his arms raised to heaven. As long as his arms were up, Israel prevailed. When his arms dropped from exhaustion, Amalek gained the advantage. Aaron and Hur saw it, stepped in, and held Moses' arms up until sunset, one on each side. Victory came not because of superior weapons or numbers, but because of the posture of the leader and the support of the community. Nobody wins alone, not in war, not in life, not in faith.
You need people holding up your arms when you're weary. You need to stay in a posture of dependence and intercession. The lesson was clear. Battles are won in the place of prayer and partnership, not just in the strength of your sword. But even after water from the rock and victory over Amalek, the pattern of complaint continued. The people saw miracle after miracle, yet their default response remained grumbling. Why? Because the real battle wasn't external, it was internal. The giants weren't in Canaan yet, they were inside their own hearts. The real enemy wasn't Pharaoh's army or Amalek's swords, it was the slave mentality that refused to die. And God was patient. He kept providing, He kept protecting, He kept teaching. But the generation that left Egypt was running out of time to learn. The desert was their school, and the curriculum was trust. Every test was designed to expose the areas where Egypt still had a hold on them. Every miracle was designed to replace fear with faith, complaint with gratitude, self-reliance with God-reliance. But some lessons can only be learned through repetition. Some hearts can only be reshaped through prolonged waiting, and some generations are too deeply programmed to change. That's why God allowed the clock to run out on the old generation. He had a new one coming, one that would learn the lessons their parents refused.
3 months after leaving Egypt, Israel arrives at the foot of Mount Sinai. The mountain shakes. Smoke pours from its peak like a furnace. Lightning splits the sky. A trumpet blast, not from human hands, grows louder and louder until the entire camp trembles. The people stand at a distance, terrified, and God speaks out loud to an entire nation. He gives them the 10 Commandments. Notice how he begins, not with demands, but with a reminder. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. First grace, then law. First rescue, then response. This is always God's pattern. He doesn't say, obey me so I will save you. He says, I have already saved you. Now here is how to live as my free people. Moses climbs the mountain to receive the stone tablets and detailed instructions for the tabernacle, the sacred tent where God would dwell among them. He's gone for 40 days, and in those 40 days, everything falls apart. The people go to Aaron, Moses' own brother, the future high priest, and say, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. Aaron, in one of the most staggering acts of leadership failure in the Bible, collects their gold earrings, melts them down, and fashions a golden calf. The people dance around it and declare, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Stop. Just stop and feel the weight of that. These are the same people who watched 10 plagues devastate Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. They ate manna from heaven every morning. They camped at the base of a mountain shaking with God's presence. And in 6 weeks, they melt their jewelry into a cow and worship it. This moment shatters one of our deepest assumptions, that if people just saw enough evidence that they would believe. That if they witnessed enough miracles, they would stay faithful. Evidence does not produce faith. Miracles do not transform hearts. You can watch God split the sea on Monday and build an idol on Tuesday. The problem was never lack of proof. The problem was the condition of the heart. And notice, they didn't create a new god. They made a calf, the sacred bull of Egypt, Apis, Hathor, the gods they grew up with in slavery. When the pressure came, when the waiting got too long, they didn't reach for something new, they reached back for something old, something familiar, something Egyptian. This is what makes the golden calf so devastating. It wasn't just idolatry, it was regression. It was proof that even standing in the shadow of Sinai with God's smoke still rising behind them, the pull of Egypt was stronger than the pull of freedom. Have you ever done this? You experience a breakthrough, you hear God clearly, you step into something new. Then discomfort hits, waiting drags on, and you reach back for the very thing God delivered you from, the old habit, the old relationship, the old mindset. That's the golden calf, and we all build them. That's precisely why the desert was necessary. 2 years after leaving Egypt, Israel arrives at Kadesh Barnea, the southern border of the Promised Land. They can see it, The destination is right there. Moses sends 12 scouts, one from each tribe, to explore Canaan. They return after 40 days carrying a cluster of grapes so massive 2 men had to carry it on a pole between them. Pomegranates, figs, proof the land was real, rich, and right there for the taking. All 12 agree. The land is exceedingly good. It flows with milk and honey. The facts were not in dispute. What divided them was interpretation. 10 scouts saw giants and fortified cities and concluded defeat. 2, Joshua and Caleb, saw the same giants and said, "We can certainly do it. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us in and give us the land." Same evidence, completely different conclusions. The difference wasn't the data, it was the lens, and the lens was shaped by identity. The 10 scouts said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Grasshoppers. After plagues, Red Sea, manna, Sinai, they still saw themselves as insects. This wasn't cowardice, this was a 400-year identity wound. They couldn't conquer because they couldn't see themselves as conquerors. Joshua and Caleb said, "Their protection is gone, the Lord is with us." The people's response? They talked about stoning Joshua and Caleb. Then they said the fatal words, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Back to Egypt, after everything. God's heartbroken response? How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? That's not an angry tyrant, that's a wounded father. How many seas do I have to split? How many signs do I have to give? The sentence, "Not one of that generation who saw my glory and disobeyed will enter the land. Your children will enter. You will wander 40 years, 1 year for each day the scouts explored." Layers here. Identity crisis. Slavery convinced them they were grasshoppers. Unbelief, despite evidence, the most dangerous kind. Protection. God shielded them from self-destruction. They weren't ready for Canaan's battles. Daily dependence. The manna lesson needed time. Danger of prosperity. Abundance can make us forget God. Prophetic pattern. 40 is testing/transformation. Kadesh Barnea was the hinge. They stood at the edge of promise and chose fear over faith. That choice cost them everything.
Here's what most people get wrong about the 40 years. They picture silence, abandonment, God turning his back. Nothing could be further from the truth. The pillar of cloud never left. Every day for 40 years, a visible manifestation of God's presence hung over the camp. Cloud by day shielding them from the desert sun, fire by night lighting the darkness and giving warmth. When the cloud moved, they moved. When it stopped, they stopped. All they had to do was look up and see God is still here. The manna never stopped. Every morning, 14,600 mornings, God provided breakfast for an estimated 2 million people in a place where nothing grows. Clothes didn't wear out. Shoes didn't fall apart. Deuteronomy 8 verse 4 says their garments lasted 40 years. Their feet didn't swell. Every time they put on a cloak or laced a sandal, they wore a miracle. This was not punishment. This was relentless, stubborn, daily faithfulness. God cooked breakfast for a complaining people for 4 decades without missing a day. There were painful moments. Korah's rebellion swallowed by the earth, venomous snakes after more grumbling, healed by looking at the bronze serpent, foreshadowing Jesus lifted up. Moses himself failed at Meribah, struck the rock instead of speaking to it, and was barred from the land. But even then, God's presence never departed. The desert wasn't abandonment, it was stubborn love. God refused to let go. He sustained, protected, taught, disciplined, day after day. Why? Because he was raising a new generation. The old one couldn't shed Egypt, but their children, born in tents, fed by heaven, guided by the cloud, grew up knowing no life except dependence on God. They had no nostalgia for Pharaoh's table, no inner voice saying slavery was safer. They knew in their bones that every breath came from God's hand. The desert was an incubator. It stripped away distractions, false securities, competing loyalties. It left Israel alone with God. And in that solitude he spoke tenderly to their hearts, just as Hosea later said, "I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her." The 40 years weren't wasted, they were formative. They forged a people who could enter the land not as slaves, but as sons and daughters ready to possess what God had promised. God didn't give up on Israel, he doubled down, and he does the same with us. Your desert isn't proof he's forgotten you, it's proof he's committed to you. Near the end, even Moses, the greatest leader Israel ever had, stumbles. At Meribah, the people demand water again. God tells Moses, "Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out water." Instead, in a moment of exhaustion and frustration, Moses strikes the rock twice and shouts, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Water flows anyway, but God says to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy before the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Moses, the man who stood before Pharaoh, climbed Sinai, spoke with God face to face, interceded for Israel again and again. Even he faces consequences. Nobody is too important. No one gets a pass because of past faithfulness. One moment of misplaced anger, one failure to honor God's holiness in public, and the greatest leader in Israel's history loses the right to finish his mission. It's heartbreaking. God brings Moses to Mount Nebo. From the top, he shows him the entire promised land, north to south, east to west, the rolling hills of Galilee, the forests of Lebanon, the Jordan Valley green and lush below. He sees it all, everything he labored for, everything he believed for, everything he suffered for. And God says, "This is the land I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses dies there on the mountain. The Bible says his eyes were not weak, his strength not gone. He wasn't dying of old age or sickness. He was as strong as ever. But God said, "It's time," and Moses obeyed, one last time. God buries him personally in a valley in Moab, in a grave no one has ever found, as if God wanted to say, "This one is mine." Israel mourned for 30 days. Then leadership passed to Joshua, the faithful scout who 40 years earlier had said, "We can do this. God is with us." Moses' death is sobering. It reminds us God holds leaders to a higher standard because their actions represent him. It reminds us no one is indispensable, and it reminds us obedience matters to the end. Even the greatest among us must finish well. Moses saw the land he didn't enter, but his faithfulness paved the way for others to do so. Sometimes our greatest contribution is preparing the next generation, even if we don't get to walk in ourselves.
40 years later, everything has changed. The old generation is gone, every last one buried in the desert, just as God said. Standing on the plains of Moab is a new people, born in tents, raised on manna, guided by the cloud. They have no memory of Egypt, no nostalgia for Pharaoh's table, no inner voice whispering their slaves. They know only dependence on God. They've seen the pillar of fire light their nights. They've gathered bread from heaven every morning. They've watched God sustain an entire nation in a place where survival should have been impossible. They're forged, hardened by the wilderness, shaped by trust, ready. Moses delivers his final words, the book of Deuteronomy. He reminds them of everything: plagues, Red Sea, manna, golden calf, Kadesh Barnea, 40 years. He warns, "When the Lord your God gives you this land, don't say in your heart, 'It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in.' It is because of his promise and his grace." Leadership passes to Joshua. God's words to him echo through history. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." When Joshua leads them to the Jordan, it parts, just like the Red Sea 40 years earlier. They walk through on dry ground. This time, no looking back. The manna stops the next day. They're in the land. No more daily bread from heaven. They eat the produce of Canaan. The time of preparation is over. The time of possession begins. And this new generation does what their parents couldn't. They fight. They conquer, city after city, battle after battle,
Not because they're stronger or braver, but because they've been forged in the desert, because they know who their God is, because they have no Egypt to return to, no Pharaoh in their heads. One man stands out, Caleb. At 85 years old, 85, he goes to Joshua and says, "Give me this mountain." Not a valley, not easy land, the mountain where the giants live, the Anakim, the very giants that terrified the scouts 40 years earlier. Caleb says, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming." 40 years of desert didn't weaken him, it forged him. While the faithless generation saw those years as a death sentence, Caleb saw them as training. Same desert, same years, completely different outcome. The difference? His heart. He believed God from the beginning, and he never stopped. Now, let's bring this home. Are you in a desert right now? Maybe you've been there a long time. Maybe you feel forgotten. Maybe you've prayed and nothing seems to change. Maybe you look around and see only sand and silence, and you wonder if God has abandoned you. He hasn't. Maybe your desert is waiting for a door to open, a prayer to be answered, a season to shift. Maybe it's loss, the loss of someone you love, a dream, the life you thought you'd have. Maybe it's loneliness, illness, failure, or that crushing feeling that everyone else has crossed their Jordan while you're still stuck. I need you to hear this clearly. Every desert has an expiration date. 40 years is the longest in the Bible, and even that one ended. The Jordan parted. The manna stopped because it was no longer needed. The land was real. The people who endured walked in. Your desert is not forever, but what you do in the desert determines what you carry out of it. Caleb carried strength. The grumblers carried nothing. They didn't even make it alive. Right now, the manna is still falling for you. The cloud is still there. Your shoes are not wearing out. God is not punishing you. He is preparing you. The desert is not your destination. It's your training ground. It's where God strips away everything non-essential, so the only thing left is you and Him. So here's the question. Will you be the first generation or the second? Will you spend your desert years grumbling, looking back, wishing for the pots of meat in Egypt? Or will you be like Caleb, using the waiting to grow stronger, deepen trust, become the person who can walk into the promised land and actually possess it? The difference between 11 days and 40 years was never distance. It was heart. God is not asking you to be perfect. He's asking you to trust Him, to stop looking back, to stop seeing yourself as a grasshopper, to stop trying to elect a new leader and return to chains. He's asking you to look at the giants in your life and say what Caleb said. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Your promised land is real. It's not a fantasy. It's not just for other people. God promised it to you, and God doesn't break promises. But you have to be willing to cross the Jordan. You have to face the giants. You have to let the desert do its work in you. Because the God who brought you out of your Egypt is the same God who will bring you into your promised land.
When Joshua led the people across the Jordan, God told him to have 12 men pick up 12 stones from the middle of the riverbed and stack them on the other side. A monument, a pile of rocks. Why? So that when your children ask tomorrow, "What do these stones mean?" you can tell them, "This is where God brought us through." One day you're going to look back at this season, this desert, this waiting, this struggle, and you're going to stack your own stones. You're going to tell someone, "This is where God sustained me. This is where He fed me when I had nothing. This is where He carried me when I couldn't walk. This is where I learned to trust Him." Your desert is not the end of your story. It's the chapter that makes everything after it possible. Don't die in the desert looking back at Egypt. Cross the Jordan. Take the mountain. Your 40 years can end today. I want to leave you with this blessing from Numbers 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face toward you and give you peace. If this video spoke to your heart, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and share it with someone who's in their own desert right now and needs to be reminded that God has not forgotten them.
In the comments, tell me, what's one stone you're stacking today? One way God has sustained you in your wilderness. Let's build monuments together. May the Lord give you strength for today and hope for tomorrow. He's faithful, He's with you, and your promised land is waiting. I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.